Hi, and welcome to Virtual Coffee Season 3 special episodes. Today, we kick off a new season dedicated to climate change and food of the future. Today's episode is based on Our Changing Menu, a book about climate change, the food we love and need. We have today two of the authors, Professor Mike Hoffmann from Cornell University and Dr. Danielle Eiseman, also from Cornell University. I hope you enjoyed this and you increase your science literacy through the wonderful stories they're going to share with us in the way they wrote this wonderful book. By the way, this amazing book about climate change and food is available on Amazon with a special discount for a limited time. Enjoy.
I'll start, is essentially the heart of our book, our story. If you can imagine going to a restaurant, picking up the menu, we can tell stories about everything on there because something is changing. But our story, as oftentimes happens with climate change, is not one of doom and gloom. Right now, I'm thinking of pecan pie, my favorite. So we celebrate food. We celebrate it being part of family histories. Actually, when you think of tequila, you think of Mexico. There's just all these connections we have with food. It's also a big business. Millions of people are employed in this industry. And for each of the ingredients we talk about, we select specific ingredients on the menu. We talk about, where it comes from. We dig a little deeper. Who's growing it? It's kind of fun. It took a lot of effort to fill in all the details on the menu, but like a typical fine dinner, we start with before dinner beverages, beer, wine, and spirits. And then we move on to salads, the main course, sides, desserts, and coffee. I think how we'll do this is Danielle and I will pick our specific menu item off of here as we proceed, and we can dig a little deeper into what's happening. And I'll start with a good Chardonnay wine. So the extreme heat in California affects the quality of the grapes, which affects the wine, the sugar content, a variety of other things, aromatics. That's a challenge for winemakers in California and Europe. Also, the lack of winter chill is another thing few people realize, but warming winters are affecting a lot of fruit and nut crops. They need to go into a dormant state. If they don't produce. So that's a challenge. It's already affected major crops, but it's on the horizon for grapes. And all of this means, maybe our favorite wines won't be on the shelf in the future, or they may be grown someplace else, or they may, lose some of their characteristics. So I'll let Danielle pick another one of those wonderful beverages to talk about.
Surprised you didn't go with gin, Mike. We both share a love of gin, but I think for me also it would be beer. So that's one of my favorites. Are nice, bitter, hoppy beers, and given that 70% of the hops grown are grown in the Northwest of the United States. There's a lot of challenges that hops growers are facing, not only with the recent wildfires, which are happening more frequently, but also, again, with the melting glaciers that provide a lot of the spring water or the melting snowpack that provides a lot of the spring water for growing hops. And the really bitter hops that I personally enjoy require a lot more water than some of the other varieties of hops. And so it's becoming more challenging and more expensive to grow those varieties because of the need for water. And then also the brewing process, which requires a lot of water as well. So it's becoming more and more difficult, especially out west, to have access to water. And so there's been discussions of possibly using recycled water or gray water to help with the brewing process, which will ultimately alter the flavor of beer. But I think one of my favorite stories that has come out of our research for the book is the use of hops hunters. So there are these people that go out into different areas and look for new varieties of hops that are more resistant or more tolerant to the changing conditions. And there's one hops hunter that we interviewed, and I think he's based out of New York, but he was going out into the deserts in Arizona and finding drought resistant hops varieties that could be used to make beer. So I think there's ways that we're adapting that are very interesting to help make sure that the menu is continues in the way that we like it, or the way that we enjoy it.
And since the first part of our menu is my favorite, these beverages, just one quick final story, and that has to do with bourbon, which is typically aged in oak barrels outside, and under normal conditions, they lose about 2% by volume every year by diffusion through the oak. And they call that the angel share. But now it's getting warmer, and the angel is taking more. And it's actually tens of millions of dollars of losses every year for bourbon, and again, other of these delectable beverages that are aged out of doors. And so let's move on to salad, and I'll just pick up on avocado, which is something we love. We now are the largest importer of avocados from Mexico. That's where most come from. And to grow those avocados, they're having to open some of the native forest, which is an issue, but we are the ones that benefit from that. California production will probably drop by 20 to 40% in the next 40% the next 20 years because of increasing temperatures. So that's one of our favorites, again, through plant breeding and other mechanisms, and something we'll get to later, climate smart farming, we can kind of minimize that impact. But that's one thing that's affecting salads.
We really wanted to add that human element, and we thought that just talking about the size of the industry wasn't enough. We wanted to share the stories of the people that are experiencing a lot of these impacts firsthand. So again, really humanize these issues, and also put a face or name to the different experiences. And so we wanted to show the different processes involved in producing a lot of these different foods. So I mentioned the hops hunter that we interviewed, but we interviewed people from farmers to ice cream executives. I think Carrie spoke to someone at Ben & Jerry's about their experiences and challenges in producing ice cream to the current quality that it's been at, and maintaining that quality. Also, a lobster, I forget the correct, is it Fisher, a lobster person? I forget the correct terminology for someone that catches lobsters, because it's not exactly like fishing, but and then I spoke to a former classmate of mine, Andres Padilla, who's he was at the time the creative director for Rick Bayless's restaurants in Chicago, and he was overseeing a lot of the cuisine and menu development at Lena Brava, which is in the River North area of Chicago. So a very popular neighborhood with lots of restaurants. And so it was fascinating to sit down with Andreas and talk to him, especially after so much time had passed since we'd been in culinary school together. And he was able to provide so many examples from his own experience of cooking in Chicago that really demonstrates what's happening and the challenges that chefs make or are facing. So for one example, Rick Bayless's restaurants are known for having their own gardens, so they can source a lot of their own ingredients right there, so that they have rooftop gardens in the restaurants that they own. And one season they were, they typically grow their tomatoes for salsas and things like that. So there's a lot of tomatoes used in their menus. And one season the crop was completely ruined because of some of the changes that were happening in Chicago. And so they had to all of a sudden source tomatoes and buy from outside their own restaurants, which was something that they struggled with. And then another example he provided is, in Chicago, there's a lot of seasonality around the foods that are presented in menus there. So in the spring, when everything starts to come out, there's ramp season. So ramps are kind of like a wild onion, very similar to an onion or garlic type of flavor. And it's very special and unique, and it's a very short season. And all of a sudden ramp season was showing up later. And when you come to, or when you're starting to plan your menus in for the seasonal vegetables that are coming out, it's hard to plan for those changes. And then after ramp season is morel season, which is a mushroom, and that again has been shifting. And so it's become more and more difficult for restaurants that really have seasonal menus to adapt to that and to include that in their planning for some of their special menus.
Some of the other stories, there was one of a individual who works in a distillery in Tennessee, and they buy all these specific flavors and ingredients from around the world, and one of those being vanilla. And a few years ago, and we're talking large quantities of vanilla, natural vanilla. And because of increasing hurricanes in Madagascar, which is the main source of natural vanilla, the price went up 350%. So for this individual, that was not a trivial change, given the quantities of natural vanilla they purchased. So it just, another example would be, Carrie interviewed a gentleman in Central America who traditionally had worked on coffee, helping farmers there with a non-government organization adopt climate smart farming activities and stay in business. But now his story has shifted. He's helping them start to produce cacao because the conditions are no longer ideal for coffee, but it's okay for cacao. So it's a transition from one crop to another. Another story was a sheep farmer at the headwaters of the Colorado River in Wyoming. 6,500 sheep, 50 sheepdogs, quite an operation. Also recognized for their sustainability efforts as farmers. They move the sheep around, they don't overgraze, they care for the land. But drought was severely affecting the grazing land for the sheep. And one side story he told was they typically ride horse in the forest. They can no longer do that because the bark beetles have come through and killed all the trees. And now there's a risk to simply riding a horse to the forest because the trees are falling down. And he hoped someday that his grandchildren could get back on a saddle and on a horse and ride through those woods someday when things have returned to somewhat normal. Also an interview of a relatively large farmer in California with 5,000 acres. diversified farm, many kind of nut and fruit crops, field crops, seed crops, but also prunes, a major producer of prunes. And he was experiencing this lack of winter chill. Yields were dropping, which again was a big deal for him because that was one of his more important crops. But warming winters were affecting yield and they were starting to decline, and he was starting to worry about his other tree crops also being affected. So there's 20 to 24 stories like this throughout the book that really bring it home to what people on the front line with climate change are experiencing and what they're doing about it. It's another one of these eye-opening changes that most people don't think about. I assume some of your attire includes cotton. Mm-hmm. So it's clothing, exactly. It's medicinal herbs, it's dye, pet foods, perfumes, cosmetics, plant-based cleaners. Now, they're not necessarily all dependent on plants, but they may use different scents, et cetera, from different plants, and they depend on that, but they could probably get by. But some of these are truly dependent on plants. And I'll start with perfumes. In France, those farmers producing the flowers, the orange blossoms for perfumes, actually sued the French government over climate change because it was destroying their business. And as mentioned earlier in the other episode, plants are changing because carbon dioxide levels are changing, heat, water, soils, and that affects the biochemistry of these special plants that are used in cosmetics and so on. Medicinal herbs, many of those are collected from the wild at mountainsides. Well, it's warming, and the plants can't necessarily just pick up and move to stay where the temperature's colder at higher altitudes. They're also weeds are coming into other species that outcompete them. So they're at risk, just let alone the changes in water conditions and temperature. So all you have to do is just look around your home and look at an ingredients, and you're going to find plants in most. The other big one are the textiles like cotton, which is susceptible to water stress, needless to say, and higher temperatures. And these are multi-billion-dollar industries that are being compromised that we depend on because we eat a lot of them and we wear a lot of them and use them in our daily life. So it's also, I think, a really exciting story to tell to raise awareness about how climate change is affecting all of us.
Well, I think it's on the other side of that. It's one thing that I can't remember. A friend told me this about 10 years ago, and it was something that I never really realized, was that a lot of the synthetic fabrics are derived from petroleum. So there's certain choices that we can make in the clothing that we buy, and textiles is such a huge industry that you could opt for more sustainable clothing options that don't contribute to a lot of these impacts that we're experiencing. So avoiding things like polyester or rayon is another thing to consider.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Look forward to seeing you again in our next episode.